There's the like freak out sort of model, which I think a lot of people love. Um,
Hmm. Which has a corollary of push everything until deadline and then just do it in the crunch time. And then you
yeah,
feel
because
like you've made a lot of progress.
yeah.
Hi, I'm Divya,
Hi, I'm Karan.
and this is Thinking on Thinking.
Okay, I think we should do the first one, which is the what is confidence and doubt, and where do you need to be for success? Um, I think the side of it that I was thinking more about was like how something we were talking about a little while ago, that like you that in thinking about where you need to be for success, you can think about it in terms of like what sort of blocks do you need, and then how can you assemble those sort of blocks. And I think of that kind of like additive way of thinking about it is really just it's like a nice sort of model because it helps you feel like you're making progress even when you're often not like making visible sort of progress, if that makes sense.
Hmm. What other models are there?
That's a good question. There's the like freak out sort of model, which I think a lot of people love.
Hmm. Which has a corollary of push everything until deadline and then just do it in the crunch time. And then
Yeah,
you feel like you've made a lot of progress.
yeah. Well, I think a lot of people don't um, they go after it head on, right? And I think that's maybe the more typical sort of model. It's like oh, I want to be a singer, let's say, right? And I'd like to perform like in front of people and perform in the way that I'm singing. And so you're going to go out and say, okay, what do I like the things you need to be as like obviously you need to be a good singer. You need to get like exposure to the space, right? That would be kind of just going into it head on, right? Whereas like if you take a step back from maybe like okay, like what are the components of being a good singer? Well, you need to be good at negotiation. You need to be good at being able to make people understand what you are good at. You need to be like good at articulation of your talents and being able to figure out like what does it mean to be in the right place at the right time. And those are all kind of separate skills that if you think about it in that way, then it's less, I don't know, it could be less overwhelming, but also can help see transferability in the skills that may or may not be as apparent when you kind of are looking at it as a conglomerate, as part of this big thing that you want.
Hmm. This is interesting because, like, very honestly, I have always thought about it like assembling different skills and how they would be connected. Like, the easiest way would be, when you want to get back, like, if you ask somebody, I want to get better at writing, people would say just read a lot more and like critically analyze and like read out of out of the genres that you want to write in, read outside of your interests, and like read the classics, see how things have changed over time, like try to understand it. And I think there is like this weird sort of our brain is good at pattern recognition and we can do it in ways that we can't cognitively like consciously sort of pinpoint. I think that like I've always had an understanding of it in a weird way. Like when I first started doing design, I also somehow understood that I also need an understanding of psychology. Very few people, at least like, 10 years ago, very few people were directly talking about the impact of psychology on design. But there is a direct impact, of course, how people behave and when you want them to do certain things, those are very closely related. But like that's why I asked what are other ways, because at least from my perspective, you have to think about in an ecosystem format in your head. Like in your head, you are constructing an ecosystem of knowledge, and somehow you're gonna get to the other side of, oh, now I have enough data to solve this problem. I don't know. I don't know if that like even relates to the initial question.
No, I think it does. I mean, it's not, I'm sure, I'm not sure if it would be that helpful. because I guess, or maybe I should ask a question to make it something more helpful. So, how do you feel like what does one do to get if you are not like if, as has happened to me many times, right? Like, like I'm looking at a problem and I'm not sure, right? Like I didn't have that moment which you kind of had with design where you're like, oh, the right thing for me to do now is to learn psychology, right? Like how do you when you're not sure, then what do you do?
I mean, I guess, mm, okay. So how would I do it if I were to now go and learn something, right? Um, so for example, these days I'm like trying to write more, which means that I'm like trying to read a lot more. That is like a side effect. Like this year, I have read way more than I think I have ever read in like in terms of speed compared to ever before in my life. And I think that like that's just a side effect of I want to write more, so I should be reading more. It's just natural, right? If I were to, for example, if I were to try to learn a new language, I would do things which are like gonna help me build vocabulary, right? Boring, just vocabulary building stuff. But I would also like try to immerse myself in like media from that culture, even if I don't understand it. Just getting a hang of okay, this is what the rhythm of the language sounds like. This is how people interact with each other. It doesn't directly like so. For example, if I was trying to learn Arabic, watching a lot of Arabic shows is not going to improve my Arabic vocabulary. I won't be able to construct sentences, but what I would be able to understand is how people in that language speak. So this is I don't know if I have sent this to you, but like I was listening to a very interesting episode of 20,000 Hertz recently where they were talking about the Windows audio landscape and especially like the work that they did in Windows 7. And what they were trying to do is they had a recognition that because of all of the beeping and all of the noises that people are seeing from their devices, it's already becoming very psychologically disruptive. And they didn't want it to be as disruptive. So what they did was like they sort of collected, for example, hello greetings from a lot of different languages, and they tried to see what is the intonation. How is hello, or like, what are you doing? Here is something new, right? Like, and in different languages, they just like sort of mapped out what was the pattern of it, and then they used that sonic pattern as the melody.
Interesting.
And somehow because of that the entire like and how we constructed it is like the entire language of how the operating system is speaking to you, all the different beeps and nudges and sounds, they form a collective, I guess, like language. And in most cases people don't think about things in terms of we are constructing a language of patterns. They're all going to be related in some way to each other while they are distinct. The example they gave was if you're in a rainforest, you'll be able to distinctly figure out what sound is what without feeling alerted or disrupted by everything. And they wanted to construct that kind of a thing. Of course, it's like
Interesting.
very like it's very simple sounding, but it's a way more complex to do because, like you said, you don't feel like you're making progress.
Well, so that's actually where I was. So like it seems because the question we started was like was on the road to success, right? Like how do you where do you feel like you're getting there? And so I'm curious about that particularly then, right? Like so if you're approaching something like how you were just describing, how do you decide when you're successful?
I mean, if you were to make bread, for 80% of the process, it wouldn't seem like the bread is being made. There is no bread until the last 10 or 20%. Like you put it in the oven, and at the last point, you'll feel like, oh, now there is bread.
Sure, but in that case, I can look at, the like what does bread look like at different stages, right? And I would know whether or not I'm like, and it's happened to me, right? Where like sometimes I'm like, oh, this bread should not look like this at this stage, and it gives me worry about my eventual success. But what do
Hmm.
you like? How do you establish those kinds of checkpoints when you're kind
I
of
mean,
approaching in a more sort of
you could ask people, like, for example, I don't remember where I was reading, but I was like reading somebody's advice for like how to spend time on your novel or something about writing. And they basically said that one third of the time will go in plot construction. And this is like you haven't started writing. You are just making plots and you're just figuring out beats and you maybe have like outlines of what the characters will be like, what they will do. These are the locations. You're doing some amount of world building, but of course a lot of it is some. So you can like, maybe let's say writing a novel takes you 2 years. For the that means that for the first like, almost 8 months, you're gonna feel like nothing is being made. I'm not doing anything. And 8 months is a reasonably long amount of time to stress yourself out. But like like the easiest way would be to look at somebody and be like, oh, this is how long it's gonna take. And also to not discredit pre-production work in general. And I feel like this is a problem with tech industry. They just don't respect pre-production or post-production. That's why like so many things are basically like they just fall apart very quickly if you just poke at it too hard.
Interesting. Interesting.
Like, of course, there is like the danger of you haven't produced anything for too long and you don't want to fall in that trap. At least, like, what helped me was just to do things like just to make smaller scope. Like,
Okay.
it, it's it's harder to get to assess. For example, am I making progress in a game if I think that the timeline is going to be 3 years? Maybe I'm making progress, maybe I'm not. Is this going to contribute to something? But if I know how to make a game in a month, then I'll have a good idea of, okay, this is what the game making process is going to be like. So then maybe if I try to make something in 6 months, I'll have, okay, this is going to be expanded. This is, for example, why a lot of people don't just start with making feature films. They make like
Hmm.
shorts, which are like 3 minutes long, and then they make like a 20-minute film. Not a 20-minute film, they make a lot of those. But
Yeah.
at least like that's how I would think one could divide like I also think that when I ask to think, what am I using success for? Is it fuel to keep me going forward, or is it a metric for am I going in the right direction?
Interesting. How do you think about it?
I think, thankfully, I don't know if it is internal wiring or if it is somebody. I personally feel like it's just okay. Am I moving in the right direction? I'm okay with dropping things in between if they don't align with. These days, I'm also okay with dropping things for a while and then coming back to it once I know that I have the requisite skills. It's a little bit like, imagine if you wanted to learn a language and you're like, I'm going to write an essay. And then you realize, okay, the essay that I want to write, I don't know half of the vocabulary. I'm going to go learn the vocabulary and then I'm going to come back and write the essay that I want to write. It's a little bit, at least like these days, that's what it's like for me. I want to use like small markers of successes. I'm going in the right direction, but not necessarily as the fuel. The fuel just comes from, am I doing a thing that I want to be doing? Because if I'm doing a thing that I'm motivated to do, then I don't need another fuel.
Yeah.
How do you feel about, like, how do you think about it?
I think progress is very encouraging, right? And so that's why I was kind of asking you about where do you see progress or how do you see progress? Um, I think I actually find sometimes that the eventual moment can be a little bit like I don't know how to exactly say it, but like almost not quite a letdown, but like something in that vein.
Underwhelming?
Yeah, right. And it's just I think because especially when you've spent a lot of time into something, like it's, if you were spending, let's say, like I don't know, 10% of your day or your week or something into bettering yourself in that way. And now if you feel like you've achieved that success, now there's 10% of your time that now is unattributed. And so that kind of sense of loss, I think, can be a little bit it can just be
Hmm.
jarring and disconcerting, right?
Yeah.
So I think that so I agree with what you're saying. I think that the focus on success can kind of lead to this it just can lead to that empty feeling in some ways, right? Where then you kind of
Yeah.
are always chasing the next thing and more and more and more.
It
Whereas I do
feels
think that, go ahead.
it feels a little bit like probably what postpartum depression would feel like. You've spent so long, like, caring for this thing, spending, planning, and now it's a thing. And it's just out there in the world. And maybe you will spend energy more on it, or maybe you wouldn't. But like it's not the same relationship as before.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think that's true. But I do think progress has an interesting kind of connection with being able to achieve your goals, I think. And I think we didn't define success when we started this, but I think success a lot of times is that, right? It's like, when, are you achieving the goals that you set out to achieve? Um, should I pause? Do you agree with that
Hmm.
notion?
So I have like recently I have been thinking about this slightly differently. So you know how like when you are, I don't know. Okay, so I probably don't have the right words for it. I'm probably not in a space where I can articulate it very well. But if you were to look at like a web, like you can represent a system like a web, any sort of organic system, like an ecosystem would be a good example. So you can think about nodes, but you could also think about the bonds that are between the nodes.
Okay.
Okay, should I say more words?
Yeah.
Okay, so of course you can set up your checkpoints as this is a checkpoint and this is a checkpoint and this is a checkpoint, right? But you could also think about it as to go from this to this, something needs to happen. Like go from node A to node B. A connector X needs to happen. And you can just focus on the connector X. So for example, once I have an understanding of what needs to happen in the story, then I will be able to write the first act. Once I have an understanding of like, so then the understanding becomes the central thing rather than writing out the plot, if that makes sense.
I see.
Like again, I don't have very advanced understanding of this thing, but like I was just trying to think about how we are almost always able to incorporate data and like course correct, right? So the goal that we started out on was never like it is rarely the goal that we end on, but there is something that happens that we are guiding like towards. And I feel like it's more of a sense of what does this connection need to be like. And that's where I was thinking about it more in terms of an ecosystem. Because if you think about
Hmm.
it, like an ecosystem always will have this like almost self-balancing factor, and like things move from one phase to another when like those relationships are satisfied. So if there is an empty spot in the ecosystem, something will move to take space off it. It's because the ecosystem is thinking more about like how the things are related to each other. Ecosystem is not thinking about anything, but like basically the system is like working in a way where like it, it's balancing the relationships rather than like individual. The pressure of
Inter-
selection is on the individual nodes. The pressure of selection is not on the relationships as much, in a way.
Interesting. It's an interesting notion.
And of course, like we have had a very hierarchical, top-down kind of language. Speaking of language, we have had that kind of language for success for the longest time. So I don't even know what a vocabulary which is more about just understanding. Okay, going from point A to point B will require an understanding of this thing, and it will require changes in these five things, and that's what we are focused on. Like I don't even know what that would look like, but I don't think that when most people are thinking about, oh, I want to be promoted, they're not actually thinking about, I want to be promoted. Like that end state of being a like person who is promoted is not what they're looking for. They're looking for, oh, I will have more money, then I will have more status. People in the office will respect me more. Like they have a bunch of other riders, like which are about their relationships and their position in the world. It's not as much about like the promotion in itself, but more about what it signifies about all the relationships and what they think of themselves.
Hmm. Hmm. That's interesting. That's a great example because I was thinking about, like, something topical this time of year is like all these, like, people are always choosing what school to go to. right? Because in the US, you have to, I guess it just happened, right? But you get your admissions on April 1st, and you have to decide by May 1st which university you're going to go to. And then, like, that's a question that like, it's like a measure of success for a lot of people, especially this year when it was so hard to get into school. Like, I don't know, do you know any of the stories? Oh,
No.
Shankar, my brother-in-law, has told me some stories because some of his nieces are applying this year, and it's just because there's so many kids from last year who deferred or didn't apply, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's this year, and then they removed a lot of the standardized tests. So especially a lot of the elite universities. So the number of people, the cost of the work to apply went down a lot. So number of applications went up. So admission rates just plummeted. You're talking single digits, low single digits. There are a lot of talented kids who didn't get into schools anywhere, right? Especially if you
Wow.
just miscalculated, it was possible, right? So I think it's just interesting to think about some of those kinds of questions where you look at success and say, oh, I've been working towards this for so long. But I think thinking about it in the calculus you were saying, which is like breaking up and saying, well, what is the thing that you're getting from it, right? Partially, it may be like, seeing yourself in it as a certain type of athlete, or seeing yourself in a certain type of social situation, or like, there's certain types of opportunities that you're trying to look and open. But distilling out those kind of, yes, this is success, and then trying to break into whether those components are, as you were kind of saying more clearly, like what is the ecosystem that is going to make me feel successful? What is the state of the ecosystem that's going to make me feel successful? You can kind of break the components into that view. It feels like it's a lot easier to understand kind of what we were talking about earlier. Like, where do you make progress? Where can you feel like you're making progress? Because you're now, instead of just looking at one journey or one aspect of the journey, there's many different components that are on their own separate journeys. Um,
I would caveat it with the thing that like there is a I mean, both of us are from prestigious colleges. Both of us have seen enough success in our career. So there's also a space of security that comes from, like how a lot of times you'll hear, oh, money doesn't make you happy. And then it's generally people who have money who are saying that money doesn't really make you happy. So I do want to acknowledge that fact that it's probably not true for everybody to be able to define their own success. You need to have achieved a certain amount of success and have that amount of agency in your life.
you know the $70,000 study, right?
No.
That like money makes you happier until you make $70,000 per year, and then it plateaus.
I think I vaguely remember, but I don't like.
Yeah, it's something around there, 70, 80,000. And then it got a bunch of publicity because this one CEO, who's actually based in Seattle, decided he was then going to pay every employee at his company that minimum amount. Um, and has now become like this outspoken advocate for the fact that we should be paying people enough to
Oh
make them
yeah, I
happy.
remember he was the one person who wasn't making like 100x of his employees.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Interesting.
Interesting.
Anyway, I think there might be something similar with success, right? That you need a certain level of just having been successful, and then you start to kind of believe. I don't know. So I thought of it when you said that because I wonder if there's a corollary with the kind of money thing. That
Hmm. That would make sense.
yeah, maybe we can explore it in a future week.
We can. Awesome. Good chat.
Good chat. This is fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Thinking on Thinking. Our theme music is by Steve Combs, and you can find a link to it in the show notes.